So, hello and welcome, and so glad you're here. I'm John, Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, my friend Bishop John Stowe, the Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, and President of Pax Christi USA. And you're going to find many other great upcoming Zooms at www.beatitudecenter.org. So first, let me again ask everyone to please mute yourself. And as we're reflecting with Bishop Stowe, if you would please write any questions or comments in the chat link so that you can ask him later. Bishop John Stowe will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions for about 45 minutes. And later on, we'll send you the recording link. So and with that, all that in mind, let's begin with a little 2-second prayer, everybody. So I invite you into a moment of silence and to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely. And as we start our sacred time together, let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus into our hearts and our lives and our circle. And ask today for all the Easter graces, all the Easter graces of peace and love, and for justice and peace for our poor world. God of peace, thank you for all the Easter blessings of life and love and peace and new hope that you give us. Be with us now and bless us as we reflect on Pope Francis's call to be gospel people of proactive peacemaking and compassion and universal solidarity. Help us, inspire us, strengthen us, bless us, and send us forth renewed, that we might follow the nonviolent Jesus ever more closely and do your holy will of nonviolence and welcome the Easter gift of resurrection, peace, and hope and new life. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So again, welcome everybody, dear friends. I was thinking that we've had Pope Francis now for 10 years, such a gift to the church, calling us, the whole human race, to practice gospel mercy and universal love and what he calls here proactive peacemaking and even creative nonviolence, to end the war in Ukraine and all the wars, to abolish our nuclear weapons, to feed and heal and welcome the poor and marginalized, and to care for and protect our common home, Mother Earth. I think he's doing a great job living up to his namesake, St. Francis. It's a blessing to be alive in the era of Pope Francis. And one of his great documents, not so well studied, I think, is his encyclical Fratelli, Tutti on fraternity and social friendship, which was published on October 3rd, 2020, which is a radical call to become global people, to see ourselves, as I understand it, as part of the global human family, not just locally or we're part of the people of the United States or whatever country we live in, but we are brothers and sisters of the whole human race. Therefore, we have hearts open to the whole world, he says, which means we need a whole new kind of politics that serve not just our own nation state, but the whole human race. And here with us to reflect on Pope Francis's great call to proactive peacemaking, I can't think of anybody better, really. My longtime friend, Bishop John Stowe of Lexington, Kentucky, who's president of the Pax Christi USA, which is the official Catholic peace movement. Hope everybody will join Pax Christi USA. Go to their website. Bishop John is from Ohio, and he's a Franciscan, a member of the Conventional Franciscans, I think originally based in St. Louis, Missouri. He studied at St. Louis, Missouri, St. Louis University, and the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley in the early 1990s, where we both got master's degrees and were classmates and friends as we were launching Pax Christi in the Bay Area. Bishop John made his solemn vows on August 1st, 1992 as a conventional Franciscan, was ordained a priest on September 16th, 1995, and then served as a pastor in Texas and eventually became the chancellor for the Diocese of El Paso, Texas. and then in 2010 was elected vicar provincial of the Conventual Franciscans and became pastor of the Basilica National Shrine of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio. And then on March 12th, 2015, Pope Francis named Bishop John the third bishop of Lexington, Kentucky. And recently he became the president of Pax Christi USA. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you all to my friend, Bishop John Stowe. So everybody, let's give a very warm round of applause and a warm welcome to your new friend, Bishop John. Welcome, John. I'm so glad to welcome you here.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with the Beatitude Center and nice to have this opportunity to reflect with you on this vision of Pope Francis for a more fraternal and therefore a more peaceful world. Father John gave a very good introduction, a nice overview of that encyclical. It sets the frame very well for what we want to do. And if we think about the spirituality of nonviolence as something that is meant to cover every aspect of our lives, Pope Francis is trying to bring that spirituality to our understanding of Christ and, of course, to the church that Christ founded, and in fact wants the church to be the global leader in promoting the peace of Christ, the Pax Christi. His vision that is expressed in Fratelli Tutti can easily be dismissed by many in the world as utopian or as something that is just beyond possibility for humanity. But Francis rejects that kind of negativity. And as he also described in his English book that was produced with the help of the journalist Austin Ivory, he's not afraid of dreaming. And in fact, humanity has to dream about what could be instead of just being stuck in the way things are. Francis is also a realist. So when we look at this encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he begins with dark clouds over a closed world. But he can't stay there because as a Christian, as a man of faith, he is also a man of hope. And so he has to turn us towards Jesus and how Jesus leads us to a better possibility. And I think there's an invitation implicit in this encyclical for all of us to get on board and recognize the original plan of God who made us to be brothers and sisters. And of course, Pope Francis builds on what his namesake tried to do in the 13th century, not only with his love for humanity and trying to promote fraternity among all people, but expanding that as we've come to appreciate now in the 21st century and to appreciate the urgency of doing so in relationship with all of creation. So we can't really talk about Fratelli Tutti without getting into Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti builds on and completes in some ways what's promoted in Laudato Si. But Fratelli Tutti was also written during the pandemic. And so Francis kind of laments our failure to take that opportunity to really come together as a human family and resolve an issue that was global in its expanse. It was global in its effect, but we did not come up with global solutions, but rather allowed our differences and our polarization to even become more pronounced and more emphasized. So before I go too far into summarizing what the Pope says, I'm going to give you an excerpt from that encyclical at first and ask you, does this not sound like what we're hearing today in too many sectors? In paragraphs 15 and 16 of the encyclical, Pope Francis says, the best way to dominate and gain control over people is to spread despair and discouragement, even under the guise of defending certain values. Hyperbole, extremism, and polarization have become political tools. Employing a strategy of ridicule, suspicion, and relentless criticism, one denies the right of others to exist or to have an opinion. Their share of the truth and their values are rejected, and as a result, the life of society is impoverished and subjected to the hubris of the powerful. Political life no longer has to do with healthy debates about long-term plans to improve people's lives and advance the common good, but only with slick marketing techniques primarily aimed at discrediting others. In this craven exchange of charges and countercharges, debate degenerates into a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. When victory consists in eliminating one's opponents, how is it possible to raise our sights to recognize our neighbors or to help those who have fallen along the way? A plan that would set great goals for the development of our entire human family nowadays sounds like madness. Does that not resonate with us in terms of the political discourse, or what passes for the political discourse in our day and age? There's nothing nonviolent in that description, which to me seems terribly accurate. At a time when we have a former president coming up on trials after having survived impeachment processes, when we have people polarized about their support or their opposition to him, and a real inability to put our focus on something bigger, more constructive, more powerful, and more capable of generating peace. Pope Francis really challenges the notion that politics is a dirty word. Given his description in those paragraphs that I just read, it's completely understandable why politics does sound like something that's not very clean, that's not very appealing, and certainly not very edifying or inspiring. But Pope Francis helps us to think about what politics is meant to be, especially if it's about promoting the common good. He reminds us that in our Christian tradition, because we are called to create an earthly city that mirrors the heavenly city, that politics is the way of expressing love, charity, and friendship. At least that's the ideal. That's what we're being called to by our Creator. Seems so far from what we see actually happening. I'm frequently bothered when people say that an action or an issue or a topic or a position is too political. Well, we have misused that word so terribly that we can't understand where the Pope is even coming from when he talks about the noble vocation of politics and friendship and love as political forces. Seems very far from our present day experience. Why does he say those things? Well, if we think about the roots of politics, the polis, the city, politics is about how we get along in a pluralistic society. How we get along when people have different views and different understandings and come from different backgrounds. And of course, today we'd have to expand different races, nationalities, ethnic possibilities, all kinds of backgrounds that make us who we are. If you think that politics is necessarily bad, what is the alternative? We live in a pluralistic democratic society, and the way we are supposed to resolve our issues is politically, because it means talking about the common good and a common solution, which is not necessarily going to make everybody happy all the time, but it is for the common good and the best we can do at a particular time. It's very important. The other way to think about it, even more graphically, is if we don't resolve things politically, we resolve them by the old might makes right, which is a violent approach. And if we want to think about what happened 2 years ago on January 6th at the Capitol in the United States, it was people who were really rejecting the democratic way of life, rejecting the use of politics to resolve our issues, and in our nation, the cherished tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. That was all subjugated to loyalty to a particular individual who was breaking down the political system and who fits the description that I just read from Fratelli Tutti very well in terms of breaking down discussion, using suspicion, ridicule, relentless criticism, etc. what happened there on January 6th with what happens if we don't know how to peacefully resolve our issues politically. So those who say the church has no business in politics are mistaken, because if the church is silent in that political realm, and I'm one who thinks we have been too silent in that political realm about the preservation of democracy, and yet at the same time, some of the voices in our pews think that all of the legislation about abortion and gay marriage and everything else, when we speak about that, that's not political. Of course, that's political as well. It's almost as ludicrous when a Republican challenges something said by a Democrat and says, well, that's just political. And the Democrat says something about the Republican just being political. Well, of course they are. That's what they do. That's what their job is. But what they typically mean by that, as do the people who would say the church has no business in politics, what they typically mean by that is partisan politics, where you have to be against one in order to be for another. Now, the longstanding approach to the church in the United States, led by really from the time of Vatican II, but even before that, introduced by the Jesuit John Courtney Murray at the Second Vatican Council, which allowed for and promoted the idea of freedom of religion, no state-established religion. That was not the preference of the Catholic Church until the Second Vatican Council. We were happier to have the state impose Catholicism as the religion. But John Courtney Murray, reflecting on the American tradition, was able to convince the leaders of the church at the Second Vatican Council that it actually allows for better Christians when Christians will make up their own mind about faith and are required to support the church and its works from their own resources, from their own means, rather than have it supported by the state. That meant the church had to say there is religious freedom. People can choose their path of religion, and that is a good thing. Our separation of church and state in the United States is a cherished tradition, argued, as I said, by John Courtney Murray at the Second Vatican Council as one that is actually beneficial and helpful to the growth and the integrity of our Catholic faith. But in the American tradition of the separation of church and state, it never says and doesn't mean that the church has nothing to say about political issues. It says that the state cannot impose a religion and cannot support or endorse a particular religion, nor can it infringe upon the free exercise of that religion or any religion. Now, we have made peace with the taxation system in the country. We have made peace with our civil way of doing things, that the church in the United States does not endorse political parties or candidates. We've seen that tested and pushed to the limits probably too frequently, but the reality is partisan, by the very etymology of the word, means divisive. And yes, you're going to have two positions or more on any given topic. And yes, people often have to take a side. But if we align ourselves uncritically with a side, we're not seeing the whole picture, and we can't really be contributing to the peace and reconciliation that has to happen after every controversial issue is decided. Again, if we decide them politically, we still have to make peace. The minority who's were outvoted still has rights. God forbid, if we do things violently, we still have to work about reconciliation. The church has, since the time of the Second Vatican Council, come to recognize that democracy is the best hope for a peaceful world. It's not a perfect solution. It's not a perfect system, and it requires ongoing care that we don't lose the privileges and the rights and responsibilities of being part of a democratic society. Now, Pope Francis' encyclical is not written only for the United States, and sometimes we in North America can forget that. We are the grand total of 6% of the church's population. But we sometimes forget that and think that our concerns and our values and our issues and our priorities ought to be number one in the mind and heart of the whole church, and particularly of the Pope, the leader of the universal church. Nonetheless, when Pope Francis signed this encyclical, it was on October 3rd, as Father John Deere mentioned, October 3rd of 2020. That was in the midst of one of the oddest and wildest presidential races in our country's history. And it was not hard to see and experience what was going on in the United States being challenged, if not outright condemned, by the words of Pope Francis in this encyclical. But he knows well that the church is not contributing to construction of a more peaceful society by merely condemning. One has to offer a constructive alternative. One has to put forward another possibility. And that's what we find here at Fratelli Tutti. If you remember what was going on in October of 2020, we were still in one of the worst parts of the pandemic. When Pope Francis signed the encyclical, he chose October 3rd because it's the vigil of the feast day of Saint Francis, the great peacemaker from the 13th century, whose name he chose when he was elected Pope. He tells us himself that during his election, when the cardinals were counting the votes to see if somebody got the required number of votes, that he was next to the Brazilian Franciscan cardinal, Claudio Hummes, who grabbed his arm when the number of votes had been reached by him, and he'd looked at Francis and said, "Don't forget the poor." And Francis tells us that's when he was inspired to take the name of Francis of Assisi, and he immediately said, the saint of creation, the saint of the poor, and the saint of peacemaking. So from the very beginning, the first moments of his pontificate, he begins to articulate the values of this namesake, Francis of Assisi, and what's important for the human family, not just for the Catholic Church, for the human family. When he stood on the balcony of St. Peter's that night and was introduced to the world, he called himself someone who was chosen by the cardinals from the ends of the earth. That's how we referred to Argentina, the ends of the earth. And since then, we've heard him use more and more the phrase of the peripheries, those on the margins, those on the edges. And in his pontificate, more than previous popes who have all been faithful to the social teaching of the church, Pope Francis has moved the social teachings of the church to something more than a specialty within theology or a specialization in the life of the church. He's put it front and center at the heart of the gospel. Now, this comes from somebody who was elected, as he says, from the peripheries, from the ends of the world, but more specifically from the Latin American church. The Latin American church that learned how to work communally at the time of the Second Vatican Council, and which developed a bishops' conference that was beyond a national bishops' conference. It was the regional bishops' conference, the conference of Latin American bishops, who reflected together on the implementation of the Second Vatican Council in their part of the world, and who created a new way of being church, and as early as 1968 declared a preferential option for the poor in an institution that had been seen as aligned with the crown, with dictators, and with the powerful since its inception 500 years earlier. There were subsequent Latin American Bishops' Conference meetings that had led to a refining of this vision, this new vision for the church. The most recent one before Francis's election as Pope was in Aparecida in Brazil, with a focus on becoming missionary disciples. And if that's a phrase you've heard before, it's because Francis brought it with him to the center of the church. He challenges the followers of Christ not to accept things as they are, but to go out into the world and to help the world embrace the nonviolent Christ of the Gospels. And Francis knows in this day and age, as it has always been, that one teaches more profoundly by example than by words. Fratelli Tutti is a document that is definitely worth your time to read. If you've never read a papal encyclical before, you'll find that Francis writes in a much more accessible way but I wouldn't advise sitting down and trying to read it cover to cover. I think you're better off taking a chapter at a time and letting it sink in what he's actually trying to say in a particular section. The way that he writes, the way that he teaches, often includes a repetitious way, almost a circling around the issue more and more before one actually lands on what is to be done. But he writes in an accessible way. He's not just writing for doctors of theology or philosophers or clergy. He's writing to the whole world. And particularly in this encyclical, is inviting the whole world to rediscover what it is to be sisters and brothers. Maybe you remember the image, the powerful image of Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square on a rainy day when he is alone with the Blessed Sacrament, with the Eucharist in St. Peter's Square, reflecting upon the disciples in the boat during the storm with Jesus, and asking the disciples, asking Jesus, aren't you concerned that we're drowning? And the Pope used that as an apt metaphor for describing the church at the time of, and the world really, at the time of the pandemic. As he writes that down in the encyclical, which he tells us was originally designed to be, his plan was to write an encyclical about how the world's religions have to come together to work for peace and be a witness for peace. That was the original intention of that encyclical. But given the circumstances and context of the COVID pandemic, he decided to expand it beyond just the churches and talk about this vision for humanity coming together and learning to work together, live together, to move from being cohabitors of the planet to being more than colleagues, to becoming friends, to ultimately being brothers and sisters. And that's kind of the dynamic that is laid out in this beautiful encyclical. The title of it, Fratelli, Tutti, comes from the writings of St. Francis, and specifically a letter that Francis writes to all the faithful who are interested in what he has proposed as a way of life. Pope Francis, 800 years later, is writing to all the faithful, proposing a way of life, very much like St. Francis, that is based on the gospel, based on fraternity and interrelationship, based on mutual care for one for the other, based on friendship, and based on a collaborative effort for the good of all, for the common good. The encyclical begins with the lament that when the whole world was threatened by this virus, even though at the outset we had the right rhetoric, we had the right words, we had the right vocabulary to talk about needing to get through it together, very quickly we discovered that some were more in it than others, and some were more affected by others. He saw it in Italy in what the early phase of the pandemic. We certainly saw it in the United States, where we had people that were declared to be essential workers, but they were actually the ones that were put at risk for the well-being of everybody else, and rarely, if ever, compensated for the extra risk that they took. It was not the people who were necessary workers that had the leisure of being able to work from home and continue their life from within enclosure. The necessary workers, the essential workers, were the same ones that our country was putting up barriers to not allowing them to come into the country legally. At the same time that we're calling them essential workers. Disproportionate numbers of migrants, disproportionate numbers of brown and black people that suffered from COVID and who had to do the work that did not allow them to protect themselves from COVID. This is the context in which Francis issues this encyclical. And at the heart, or the centerpiece of this encyclical, is his reading of the Good Samaritan parable. Now, for most of us, it's hard to read the Good Samaritan parable with fresh eyes because it's so familiar to us. And maybe we're aware of what the Samaritans were to the Jewish people, the sworn enemies, the ones who were seen as traitors, the ones that were seen as a mixed breed who had one time been part of the Jewish fold and then went to other gods and were intermarried with those other gods. But by the time of Jesus, it's pretty much agreed that they were a hated group that was excluded from Judaism. But geographically, if one lived in the northern part of the kingdom in Israel, where Galilee is located, one had to pass through Samaria to get to the southern part of the kingdom, where the temple and where the center city, the city of King David, Jerusalem, was located. We all know that Jesus frequently makes mention of the Samaritans and scandalized his original hearers by making the Good Samaritan, as well as other Samaritans, the hero in the stories that he tells. We know that much about the Good Samaritan, but Pope Francis, again, he's using his good Ignatian background in spirituality, the methods of Ignatius of Loyola, inviting people to enter into the story, to visualize the story, to imagine it happening in our day and place, and to see which role, which person in that story do I identify with. The hero of the story, obviously the Samaritan, is the one who's able to transcend the nationalism or the ethnocentricity that his hearers were most accustomed to. But even in that circumstance, the Pope describes how the Samaritan goes into a place where he has no rights, where he has no standing within the law, where he is a rejected foreigner and outsider, and actually goes to save somebody who probably would have been part of the oppressors that kept the Samaritans in the status that they had within Jerusalem. The Samaritan is the one who sees the man beaten up on the side of the road when the Levite and the priest don't do so. They see him, but they keep on walking. The Samaritan, who has no rights in that society and no standing in that society, is one who actually takes care of the person, touches the person, heals his wounds, bandages them up, uses his own resources, takes him to an inn, engages the help of the innkeeper, who can make some money on this deal to care for this wounded man. Again, a very familiar story, but as many times as I had read it, and as many times as I'd preached on it, I never thought about the role of the innkeeper. I never thought about the role of institutions, and we can never do these kind of things on our own. We always have to be connected to a structure that helps make it possible to render the aid that was rendered there. Then I heard from a Benedictine scripture scholar who has roots in the southern part of the United States, where I live and minister. And he talked about the same interpretation of the parable and thought about the man that was beaten up on the side of the road like his own grandfather, who in the rural South said that if a Samaritan had come towards him, and he said in that context, he meant an African-American. If an African-American had come to his aid and he was the beaten up one on the side of the road, that his grandfather would have probably rather die than be helped by somebody in that position. What a powerful reflection on the role of the Samaritan. And it's probably not too far-fetched to think that a self-respecting Jew wouldn't want to be saved by a Samaritan. So strong were their prejudices. But Francis goes on throughout the encyclical to take that example, that beautiful example, and say, this is what the world needs. We have to transcend all of these divisions that we've created. We have to transcend even our concept of the nation state, and that becomes very controversial, but we have to transcend even our concept of the nation state as the basic unit of government and sovereignty, because the issues that we face are global. And as much resistance as we have to any kind of notion of global law, universal law, global government, and people really become apoplectic when that's even mentioned, as much as we have difficulty thinking about that, commerce has already done it. Business is multinational. So many aspects of our human life transcend the boundaries of nation states. But when it comes to human beings, as in migration, as in refugee crises, as in how one survives and avoids starvation, then we reassert the importance of those boundaries. When it comes to commerce and so many other things, they don't seem to be so important to us. Francis challenges the readers to think about what the world could be. And based on the simple action of the Good Samaritan, that is not beyond the capacity of any one of us, but it is heroic that he steps out of his role and performs it. Francis challenges all of us to think about that as a model for how we get along in a future that would be brighter, more just, and more fraternal. It's a beautiful image and a beautiful way of thinking about it. He reminds us that the essence of that parable was a response to the question posed by a lawyer to Jesus, who is my neighbor? And in the age of globalization, that answer has to be expanded, because we are aware of so many people, so many circumstances, so much suffering, so many places, that who is our neighbor has tremendously expanded as well. Who is my neighbor, or who acts neighborly in the parable? It was very early in his pontificate that Francis, in his pontificate, Francis talked about, he coined the phrase, the globalization of indifference. And he used that phrase for the first time on the island of Lampedusa, where he took his first trip 10 years ago as Pope, where he went to an island that had seen many shipwrecks of migrants coming from Africa, of refugees coming from Africa that didn't make it to shore, and actually celebrated Mass on an altar, with the wood that came from one of the shipwrecks. And there he pronounced this condemnation of the globalization of indifference, and he offers as the alternative the revolution of tenderness. The revolution of tenderness, which he says is exemplified by his namesake, by Francis of Assisi. The revolution of tenderness, which allows us to see each other as sister and brother and connected to each other, not allowing for the kind of indifference. He talks about, in our age of discovery, with the technology that we have, the ability to create so many things and to have so much information at our fingertips, he says the challenge is that we can discover, probably from our phones and from our home computers, new planets orbiting in the Milky Way or in the galaxies, but we can't seem to see the person in need who is orbiting right around us on our street and in our neighborhood. We have developed an indifference to the plight of those in need, often very close to us, even as our awareness of global realities continues to expand. The Pope would say there's something wrong with that situation. And so Francis reminds us of the possibilities that we have as a human family, but he calls for globalization with a shared roadmap rather than trying to do everything piecemeal. And he uses that word piecemeal to describe the violence that dominates our world situation today, what he calls the Third World War being fought piecemeal. Now, we have seen that even more pronounced since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but we've also seen it in places like Uvalde, Texas, and just this past week, Louisville, Kentucky, with the use of weapons of mass destruction in places of commerce, and even worse, in schoolhouses. We have not rejected that kind of violence because we've allowed ourselves somehow to buy into this globalization of indifference, or in the case of the weaponry, that the Second Amendment has become so important to us that, as Cardinal Suprich reminded people, it didn't come from Mount Sinai. It's not part of our faith. It's not an article of faith. It's something that we human beings can change when it no longer serves us. When Francis talks about politics, in chapter 5 is the section of the encyclical that really deals with the new kind of politics. He contrasts what today is often referred to as populism with a real concern for the people, which is something entirely different. He talks about political charity. That's not a phrase we're used to hearing together, politics and charity. But he makes a simple distinction that could be helpful. And he uses the old image of somebody helping an elderly person to cross a river, and that's seen as an act of charity. But he says, if you take that same insight and incentive, and instead of helping one old person across the river, you create the political will to build a bridge to help all kinds of people across the river, that's political charity. And that's why we have politics, to do the good things that people need with our pooled resources, but to recognize that there are people with needs in our midst. He also gives a real shout out, to use a contemporary term, to what he calls the popular movements. He has created the world meeting of popular movements from all over the globe, but they were inspired by his admiration for those who collect cardboard from the trash heaps in Argentina and recycle it for their living. And he's talked about how those cartoneros, as they're called in Argentina, have banded together. They've created, almost like a union, a fraternity among themselves. And instead of competing with each other for those limited resources, they work together and have found a way to provide for their families. He wants to see those kind of efforts multiplied on the global scale. And he calls for the whole world to think about what in Spanish can be addressed by the 3 T's: techo, trabajo, and tierra. Techo, or roof, standing for housing; trabajo, or work, labor; and tierra is land. If we would focus on those basic needs for humanity, we would have less migration, we would have less wars, we would have less starvation, we would have less impact even from climate change, because we're caring for those basic things and basic needs of the human person. That's all spelled out in there. And when we get to the final chapters of the encyclical, he talks about the importance of renewed encounter. That's been another theme of the Francis papacy, the encounter. And what seems so countercultural to us today is when the Pope insists that you can't have an encounter through electronic means when there's an on and off switch. There has to be a face-to-face connection, sharing stories, sharing life, where you can enter into the other person's experience. And that's where the possibility of friendship, and beyond friendship, to really understanding the other as brother or sister, that's where it's possible. So that's only a highlight. I think I've gone over the 45 minutes already. It's only a highlight of an encyclical that's well worth your reading. But again, I would say don't try to absorb it all at once. Read it reflectively, take a section at a time, but see that there is a vision here. And it might seem utopian. Francis is not afraid of dreaming and says that we actually have to dream of something better, or else we're condemned to continue living what we have. And that's a violently polarized, dysfunctional world, indifferent to the plight of those without, indifferent to the plight of the poor. John, you want to open it up for questions at this point, or comments? Or
Yes, and let me begin by saying, Bishop John, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. It was wise, reasonable, rational, scholarly, helpful, I can listen to you all day, and and in doing so, John, as a bishop and a Franciscan priest, it's very hopeful listening to you, given all the voices you're describing of despair and discouragement in the country and in the church as well. So I really appreciate it. You gave us a gift,
I think
and
we have to provide the
I agree.
alternative voice.
Huh?
We have to provide the alternative voice, right? And
Yeah, you did a
amplify those
great
voices
job.
and
And I'm
amplify
so
those.
glad you're the president of Pax Christi USA. Friends, if you don't have a copy, I actually like to get hard copies of these things from Francis. This is a beautiful edition, the Orbis book edition. You see Pope Francis, Fratelli, Tutti, the icon of Francis, but it has an incredible introduction by young Dan Horan at the beginning. And as Bishop John said, he just scratched the surface. Now, Bishop John, I warned you ahead of time. I have already 8 questions written down for
Oh boy.
myself. Yeah. But because we're going to be nonviolent, I'm going to go first to my good friend, a great young peacemaker in your diocese, young Rosie. And
Great.
I'm going to ask her if she'd start us off with a question. And I don't know where she went. Rosie, if you're there somewhere, can you wave? And yeah, and unmute yourself. So Bishop John, as I said, I think Rosie, you can correct me, she's a student at the University of Kentucky at Louisville. She's on the staff of Pace Bene. She's a consultant to the Beatitude Center. She's already doing great things for peace. So Rosie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'm at UK in Lexington, so I'm right here. And I was wondering, so I'm a senior at UK, and in one of my classes this week, we were sitting, everything was normal, and then suddenly all the lights went out, and we heard sort of a popping noise, and then someone in the building started yelling lockdown. And it actually turned out to be an electrical error. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was really scary to be sitting there and, wondering, okay, how am I going to get out of this building if I need to, and what's going to happen? Do I need to text my family? And I just saw all of the people around me we all reacted with such fear. And one of the things that you said that moved me was not seeing the people in need who are like right in front of you. And when you said that, I thought of students my age, younger, older, who go into their schools and they don't know if they're going to come home or not. And after that moment at UK this week, the weirdest thing to me about it was that afterward, everything went back to business as usual. There wasn't really any moment to reflect. It was just like, okay, back to class. And it really made me pause and think. And so I'm wondering, how do we talk to people about nonviolence in this day and age where we're having shootings all the time? And yeah, I'm just wondering how to react nonviolently and how nonviolence ties into all this, and just what you think about that.
Well, that image that you gave and the real fear that you and your classmates experienced is an apt metaphor. It's a real experience for you, but it describes the reality that we live with. And think yourself, you're a senior in college, a senior in the university, but you know that it was 9-year-olds at the school in Nashville that were killed, and smaller kids than that we've seen slaughtered in Uvalde and going back in Connecticut, so many places right now. And not only because of the power outage, but even after those killings, things go back to normal way too quickly, because we've accepted this background, we've accepted this as normative, and somehow we've allowed the voices, even though every poll tells us that most Americans would favor some form of gun control, some form of background check, some form of it's not just everybody should have access to AR-15s, right? But how quickly we forget afterwards. And for some reason, we allow that kind of divisive politics to dominate and not to get something done that is actually the will of the people. So I was so impressed with the kids from Parkland, Florida. In fact, when I went around that year and did confirmation, I told every class, you've got to be like those kids from Parkland, Florida. We've made a mess of this, of so many things. You've got to stand up and point us in the direction of common sense, common decency, and respect for the human person. Now, what you described, though, sadly, is the reality. We just move on to the next thing. That's part of the kind of isolation that is so, events are isolated, people are isolated, and who benefits from that? Probably those who want to keep those ridiculous laws on the books. I appreciate your way of thinking. I appreciate that experience, and just think about, somebody much younger than yourself having that experience. It breaks my heart to think that kindergartners have to go through active shooter drills, and they come home and they talk to their parents about this, like it's just another thing at school. So we have normalized something that really shouldn't be normal.
Thank you so much, Bishop John.
Thank you, Rosie. And maybe to follow up on that, Bishop John, one of the phrases that Francis uses in here, which is so beautiful, is proactive peacemaking.
Mhm.
And I want you to comment on that, maybe in light of what Rosie just said. So how does Rosie have to become then a proactive peacemaker at the University of Kentucky? All of us have to be proactive peacemakers in the US. The world has to be proactive peacemaking toward Ukraine and nuclear weapons, instead of sitting back and giving up hope and letting the inevitable violence and death and destruction happen. I hear it's a call to action. And can you talk about that phrase, proactive peacemaking?
Sure it is. Yes. And I think the proactive peace making is very much like peace building, where it's not something that's going to happen automatically. It's going to take a change of heart and some taking public stances. So when you start raising questions in your university classes about why do we allow this to happen? Do we start doing the social analysis of, if this percentage of the population is against having immediate access to weapons of mass destruction, why isn't something happening about it? And we have to continue to build up and demonstrate and do everything possible. We live in a state that was moving in just the opposite direction. You and I are living in a state where that we're making it more accessible to have guns and easier to have guns and less restrictions on background. And the solution to violence in the schools is what? Arm the teachers. That insanity of spreading more arms and more violence is the way forward. So, John, you're right. We're uncomfortable with the active part, the proactive part.
Yeah.
But we have to connect it to our faith. That's another part where too
Yeah.
many religious people, that's why I use that quote from Cardinal Supich, too many religious people don't see the absolute irony of talking about God and guns, right? They don't see that it's sacrilegious, it's blasphemous to talk about God and guns as though they go together. The God of life, and even our so-called pro-life community that likes the death penalty, that likes excluding certain people, and that likes access to guns. That makes no sense.
No, I want to come back to those questions. But it's a good lead into two questions from Teresa, and I'll read it to you. Number one, you can see them in the chat, John, but I'll read them. Number one, so the first is about parish life and the encyclicals, and the second is about what just happened in Tennessee with the 3 representatives. So number one, a seeming void exists in parish life in reflecting on the encyclicals of Pope Francis, Fratelli, Tutti, and Laudato Si. And let's just look in the United States. How do we promote dialogue in parishes to help them engage in the vision of Pope Francis? Wow, that is a great question. And John, you're a leader on that. And the second was, any reflections on what we've all witnessed from the young representatives from Tennessee, Holy Toledo, who spoke out against gun violence and the shooting there and got kicked out and now voted back in, and the vision of Pope Francis. So parish life encyclicals, and then what happened in Tennessee.
Well, as I said, Pope Francis comes from that periphery, from Latin America, and I think the Latin American church has a lot to teach us. I remember spending considerable time in the small diocese of Choluteca, Honduras, in the south, where they have trained hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to be delegates of the word. But one of the things that impressed me the most going to that place is I went into these villages and these small communities of Christians that were studying encyclicals. These are people without more than an 8th grade education, sometimes less than that. We're studying encyclicals and we're discussing how it affects their daily life and their practice of faith. I've never seen that happen anywhere in the United States. Not just with the encyclicals of Pope Francis. I've never seen anybody really get engaged in the study of encyclicals. And especially with Pope Francis, who makes them very accessible and talks about things that are about our everyday life and survival, the care of creation and the need to live together and work together. Those are things that would be perfect for parish study groups, would be perfect for Bible study groups, but they're quickly labeled as too political, going back to my starting point. Also, I'm sorry to say that the US bishops have not been cheerleaders for the wisdom and direction of Pope Francis. Quite the contrary. There has not been an active engagement and plans to implement the important teachings that Pope Francis has given us, especially in Laudato Si, but even in something like Amoris Laetitia, when he's talked about how we approach marriage and family life. We've not put those things into practice. We haven't studied them at all. So yes, the parishes don't have those kind of things. There are some online communities, and that's where the Beatitude Center gets a real plug for making these kind of things possible for people that may not have access to it in their parish. But ask for these things and volunteer to organize something and make it happen. In the case of those 3 legislators from Tennessee, especially the 2 young African American, the thing that resonated with me when the first was being voted back, the 2 Justins, when the first was being voted back by a unanimous vote in Nashville from the city council and the county government, it was like, okay, this is a new moment in the civil rights movement. What they would not have possibly done to white people, they do to 2 young and very engaged and thoughtful, powerful leaders with great futures in front of them. They're being discredited. And if you listen to the 2 of them speak, and the woman who escaped being thrown out by 1 vote, but she acknowledges completely that she was saved because she was white, and then also that it wasn't just this vote, but those young Black men had been not allowed to speak on multiple occasions and cut off because they're in the minority party, but also the minority race in that situation. So there was a real sense of hope when both of them were sent back. And I think it really, the ugliness or the exclusion of them from the Tennessee legislature really backfired on those who orchestrated it, because now the world is paying attention to what they're doing and saying in ways that they weren't before. It also reminds me of another great thing that Pope Francis said. In our day, the commandment, he said, has to be expanded from thou shalt not kill to thou shalt not exclude, because exclusion amounts to death. And when you exclude people and they speak for a particular population, especially, and you're cutting off the voices of all those people, it's just the opposite of what Fratelli Tutti is talking about.
Thank you so much, Bishop John. And especially those 2 Justins were so beautiful and eloquent. And I don't know if you saw, and it went viral, the great Joan Baez, my friend, ran into one of them on Sunday in the airport.
Yeah, Justin Jones, yeah.
Yeah, and they sang and all. But she said later, I saw it on Colbert, he started talking to her about nonviolence and that he was committed to nonviolence. And Rosie, you're going to have to interview him. And but they just give me so much hope. And one of the ways that the old gospel methodology, or the way God works, is that persecution then shines a light on great people like these two Justins, and they're so eloquent. And let's hope they rise and become real good national leaders.
That's
You
right.
were talking
They were
about the encyclical, huh? Go ahead.
I was just going to say they were students of Martin Luther King. They're students of the civil rights movement, but especially for the nonviolent option that was proposed by
Yeah,
Martin Luther King.
it's
And
wonderful.
they
It's very
articulate this
hopeful.
talk about a beloved community, which perfectly coincides with Fratelli Tutti. Martin Luther
Yeah,
King's vision of a multiracial, multicultural, beloved community.
I'll have to invite him to come on the Beatitude Center. But
I think it'd
back to
be
the
well worthwhile.
encyclical, huh?
It would be well worthwhile, yes.
Yeah, I probably can't. So somebody had asked a question that you had already begun to answer about first of all, the Pope Francis's encyclicals around the world and the message of the Pope. And you and I have experienced that in Rome, where we've met with people who are dealing with Francis around the world. And it's shocking. Like the United States, we're so far behind the rest of the church around the rest of the world, where everybody is trying so hard to follow the nonviolent Jesus and to live the gospel. And they're running with Francis. So the question was, has the rest of the world related to this particular encyclical? Are there any other examples where it is being used for positive change? And just in general, Bishop John, any other ways you want to reflect on what we have to learn from fellow Christians around the world who are learning the wisdom of this great historic figure that we're living with? I mean, I think he's the greatest pope in history. And the U.S. churches, we're being taught to ignore him and not listen to him. The media is ignoring him. And he's there still working away. So any other thoughts on that?
Yes, the current synod process that's going on is
Yes.
also about Pope Francis trying to implement Fratelli Tutti in the church, right? With listening
Yes.
to a variety of voices. Everybody has something to say. Everybody's story has to be taken seriously. And the whole process that was created for the synod, of all the continents on the globe, North America was the only one that did not have a continental assembly to process
Gee.
what comes from the synod discussions that happen in every diocese. And the US and Canada were the constituents of the North American, because Mexico went with Latin America for linguistic and cultural reasons. But between the US and Canada, the excuse sent to Rome was, we don't have the resources, we don't have the ability during COVID to have a continental assembly.
Wow.
Africa,
and yet the poorer nations did.
Africa has a continental assembly. Asia, talk about distances, talk about variety of cultures and languages and distances. Asia had a continental assembly. Europe had a continental assembly. And Europe has all kind of language and all kinds of differences going on there, and the tension around Brexit and the whole fragility of the European Union, all of that. They have a continental assembly. The Middle East, which isn't even a continent, had a continental assembly. People coming from Muslim-dominated countries where the faith is not even practiced legally were able to gather, and they all find hope in the teachings of Pope Francis and are eager to find ways to put it into practice and to meet with others who want to do that. So we're going to have to look around the globe to see where the teachings of Francis are really being lived and put into practice. Latin America, for sure. You know, you'll remember from that conference in Rome that you referenced the Philippines. What they're doing in the Philippines is just wonderful.
It's
In
incredible.
Mindanao, they teach peacemaking in the schools. It's Pax Christi materials together with other materials that have been put together in the Muslim-dominated part of the Philippines. And they're required to participate, the Muslims are required to participate in Christian services, the Christians are required to participate in Muslim services, so that they understand each other and can begin to work peacefully together. There's lots of wonderful examples going on.
Well, following up on that, as our leader, Bishop John, You know, a lot of our friends here on this call are longtime peacemakers and activists. Do you have any suggestions, encouragement, advice about what we can do for the church in the United States? It seems so many of the U.S. Catholic bishops are actively against Pope Francis and his message, and how we could support you, and just any encouragement to work with our own diocese and local church or the church in our states on these great encyclicals, on the synodality, and on the questions of war and peace.
Right. So the first thing I would say is raise your voices. We are the church. We learned that at the Second Vatican Council. We're not dependent exclusively on the bishops. I think we have to find a way for the laity to get involved in the formation of priests, because I think that's where we have a real challenge ahead of us, because we are forming a younger generation of priests that are not where the people of God are. And so they don't give that same priority. Earlier on, I said our Catholic social teaching, it's been referred to as, the best kept secret, but Francis has put it at the center of the faith, but everybody's not there yet. We have to be creating opportunities. We have to be raising voices. I hope people write to their bishops, and it gets tiring when you don't get a response, but I think it's essential. They have to hear that we're just not satisfied with the way things are, and we're not satisfied that the Pope's teaching is not getting through. Our U.S. bishops this year ended their own news service program and opt into buying from our Sunday Visitor. Our Sunday Visitor is critical of Pope Francis and even more critical of the Francis bishops in the United States. This is where our news is coming from. This is what's shaping our opinion of what's being heard. We just need to create alternative sources, number one, and how to be supportive is continue to read what comes out of Pope Francis and bring it up in church settings, and bring it up in pastoral councils, and bring it up in bulletins, and bring it up in letters to the editor.
That's great. I love that you said raise your voice first off, and I really encourage all of us to do that. And you're telling us to write our bishops. I often think, John, about poor Oscar Romero, who was such a right-wing fascist. The Jesuits of El Salvador told me that before they were killed. He was awful. And Rutilio Grande refused to write him off and kept seeing him every Sunday afternoon once he became bishop and into the couple of months before Rutilio was killed. And that friendship, that reaching out to Romero, led to Romero's conversion. I'm hoping, and I wonder if this is all right with you, that I always encourage everybody to go and meet their bishop, write a letter, send them books on Jesus and nonviolence, and get a group of friends and go and meet and say, talk to us about Jesus and nonviolence and peace. And that's how helped a lot of people, including our friend Archbishop Wester in New Mexico. What do you think of that, John?
I think it's very good. I don't know that I'd encourage going to the expense of sending books. It can't hurt, but I can tell you I've got a stack of books that I didn't ask for that it will be hard for me ever to get to read. So
I'm going to send you more.
Well, I'll
okay.
read yours, but
no, you'll read mine.
I'll read yours.
Okay, now
there's some stuff that I wouldn't necessarily read, but trying to meet bishops is a good thing. But I hope that you get a warm reception.
Yeah. So in the end of Fratelli Tutti, he focuses, after talking this call to global solidarity for a new kind of politics, to see every human being as your sister and brother. And then he says, clearly, we got to get rid of two things, war and the death penalty. And he goes on in very creative language. And I wanted to ask you to talk about that, because, again, we never hear that. And you weren't able to mention that. So any thoughts on what he said and what we can do about that?
Well, I think, even more than what he says in there about getting rid of war, there's an image in my mind I can never erase of Pope Francis in his 80s getting down on his knees and kissing the feet of leaders in South Sudan who are at each other's throats. And he's calling them both to live the Christian faith. One is Protestant, one is Catholic. And then he goes and visits that place in the midst of the violence and the crisis going on. You know, the Italian word that comes out of Francis' mouth a lot is vicinanza, nearness. And, you know, as much as he abhors war, he thinks we all have to be exposed to the consequences of war to really have that impact to working for peace. So he goes and gets close and he sees the victims. You know, we've sanitized war so much that we don't see the human cost enough, especially if it's in other parts of the world, but we don't even see, you know, the human cost of our own servicemen and women that are sacrificed to this violence and this war. So Pope Francis wants to do everything to promote the ways of peace. The area where, you know, we still don't have the answer is how do you deal with unjust aggressors? You say, well, there's creative ways of nonviolence and working against it. You know, the real dilemma for people about the Ukraine, and it's caught Francis up as well, is, you know, how many people do you allow to continue to be killed by an unjust aggressor before you invest in defense? And I think that's a painful difficulty with the desire to do away with war. It's that evil will still be promoting war. The problem is it's so much easier for evil to do that when we think we don't find it incompatible with our faith and our expression of faith to participate in that. And the death penalty, we have to keep campaigning to do away with the death penalty. Pope Francis has made it clear that's the one change he's made in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You know, that's just not a legitimate way within our tradition to do away. Now, this is a church that burned people at the stake, you know, so it's a change in our own church's position, but it's a recognition that that's not the way of Christ.
Thank you, Bishop John. We have a question about, from a high school teacher asking about, there's nothing in the USCCB curriculum about nonviolence, and would you recommend Fratelli Tutti for, I guess, high school seniors? And so that there's just that question, but that leads into the question that many of us have been working on, is asking Pope Francis to write an encyclical on nonviolence, which you yourself have been involved in with us in Rome, Marie Dennis and Ken Buddigan, for 7 years now, and Terry Wren, who's with us today. So, could you say some things about that for the high school teacher, and then just in general, how can we? What do you think about Pope Francis writing an encyclical? What's the likelihood about it? And maybe tell everybody the story of your own encounter with Pope Francis last August. Sure.
Yeah, those are all good things. One of the highlights of my time with Pax Christi in Berkeley was the initiative that we had going into the schools in the Diocese of Oakland and teaching in the classrooms and doing a peace curriculum there. And I found the students tremendously receptive. Now, in the days with so much violence in the schools, I think there'd be a very good opening when it's on everybody's mind how to create nonviolence. There's no USCCB curriculum for peace and for nonviolence, but local Pax Christi chapters have provided such things and created such things to be worked on. So I think that's an area where we can all be engaged in providing something. There's lots of good resources there. And it should be part of the curriculum. You can advocate for that being part of the curriculum. Yeah, and when it comes to the peace, and the nonviolent encyclical, we were all hopeful from the New Year's Day message that really invoked nonviolence in a profound way. And the brief conversation, the very brief conversation I had with Pope Francis about it last August was, he says it's all in there, which he meant between Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si. That's the essence of a teaching. I think that we would still find value in having it distilled into one place and laid out very explicitly, because we're not so good at picking up on the signals. I was just talking to a group yesterday about LGBT issues and Pope Francis, and we don't always pick up on everything that he's saying. First of all, Pope Francis is trying to treat us as adult members of the church that don't have to be spoon-fed everything. And sometimes he gives some provocative statements to get us thinking. And it's consistent with what he says about the church. Is it meant to replace consciences? It's meant to form consciences, and that we have to have an adult appreciation and engagement in our faith. So for example, some of the things he said about LGBT, the first thing he said was, who am I to judge? Well, people took that as a one-off thing or interpreted it in all kinds of ways. But I'm convinced what Francis is saying is, if I'm the leader of the whole church and I don't feel it's my place to judge somebody's circumstances, who do you think you are in judging somebody else's circumstances? It's about making some adult decisions, adult appropriation of the faith, adult implementation of the faith. Nonetheless, I think there would be an appetite for and a real value of having an encyclical that puts this all together, especially in light of what's happened with Ukraine, especially with the ongoing battles in South Sudan and the Congo. But my gosh, read the stuff that he writes when he meets with victims of war. The beautiful words that he shared with those who were really beaten up and maimed by war in Congo, when he said, I'm near you, the church feels your pain, but the world has to pay attention to your pain as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much
That
material.
was an amazing. Yep.
And if there's not an encyclical, and I agree with you on the importance of an encyclical, if there's not an encyclical, we could put together a compendium, like we did with the Catholic social teaching before Pope Francis, put it all together in a volume that spells it out.
Well, thank you. Actually, we did that already. We had over 100 theologians from around the world, and we sent him many copies. And then one of us in December, I don't know if you remember, that actually gave him one while he was walking by or driving by. And so that's why I think encyclical has to happen, because it's an official church doctrine, which would say the just war theory actually no longer applies. And all the condemnation of nuclear weapons that Francis has done, even the owning of nuclear weapons and possession of them as immoral, would go in encyclical and
As
become
church
law.
teaching.
And then you could change the catechism. But proactive peacemaking, you could say, wait, Jesus was totally nonviolent, and therefore Christians have to be totally nonviolent. Therefore, the church is a community of nonviolence, so we can have nothing to do with war. I think it should be called Pace Bene. I think I'm going to write him. And while I'm on a roll, John, I hope you're sitting down. Here's my question. You know that our friend Archbishop John Wester from New Mexico and I were working for a long time and to call for the closing of Los Alamos, the birthplace of nuclear weapons. And then I asked him to write an encyclical, and last year he published this incredible, beautiful thing, which I worked on, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, on the need. He was reflecting on Pope Francis's call to abolish nuclear weapons.
Right.
Well, as our teacher friend here said, there's very little from USCCB and there is on nonviolence, and there's some in Archbishop Wester's pastoral letter. In fear and trembling, but inspired by the Holy Spirit, I say, Bishop John Stowe, how about you writing an encyclical calling your diocese and the people of the United States to gospel nonviolence and just talking about the nonviolent Jesus? And I would be happy to help you. What do you think?
Okay, well, it won't, maybe a pastoral letter. It won't be an encyclical, but
A pastoral letter, I mean, a pastoral letter.
Yeah. No, I can do that. Before I do that, I'm really pushing the bishops of Kentucky with me to write something about gun control and the need to address that issue in our state. So they've agreed to it. Now I got to keep the pressure on so that it actually happens.
That's
But
terrific.
that can be
Well,
step
maybe we
one.
could,
That could be
yeah,
step one.
step two would be a pastoral letter
Nonviolence.
on Jesus and nonviolence. That has yet to happen in the United States. And I
Okay.
think it would be another good response. And as the president of Pax Christi, you could be the one to do it. Now I want to go to my, thanks, John, for letting me ask you that. My
Mhm.
friend Tatanka, who has a question. So we read in the papers recently how the Vatican renounced the doctrine of discovery. So I wondered if you could, if especially in light of Fratelli, Tutti, I get it mixed up. Say anything you want about all of that. Truth and reconciliation in the United States. He's asking our own role in complicity, talking about the church's role in complicity with systemic violence and colonialism, as opposed to the call to be sisters and brothers all. Maybe also tell people a little bit what happened in case they don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not, of course, the best expert on this. You might remember that when the
Mhm.
Pope visited Canada with the explicit purpose of asking forgiveness from the Indigenous communities there for the church's role in the schools that robbed them of their culture and mistreated and abused in many ways the residents of those schools for the Indigenous in Canada, he was asked about the doctrine of discovery and was caught off guard by that. Historians will say there is no such thing as a doctrine of discovery, but rather it's a collection of attitudes that allowed for colonialization to happen in the name of the gospel. So once we got past the terminology of what he was surprised by, the name, the doctrine of discovery, didn't know what that was talking about. So now we have a context to understand it, and it's important to say, no, there was no good theological justification. There was no religious justification for colonization, and certainly not to impose the gospel on other people or to take away indigenous rights as part of the civilization process when people had their own civilizations. So I think that's an important step forward, and I'm glad that we didn't just get caught up on the terminology, because that was a debate going on for a while. But everybody knew what the concept was, I think, the doctrine of discovery. So it was good to have that denounced. There are still some who are upset about the language that was used, whatever. But yeah, the next step is, what are we going to say about our role in the slave trade? Right? What do we say about our role in very dehumanizing attitudes and actions against people in the past? We have traditionally liked to lift up the exception to the rule, the Bartolome de las Casas, who a slave owner and then condemns the owner of the owning of slaves, the councils in Sevilla and the Council of the Indies that denounced the enslavement of native peoples, all those kind of things. We're glad to have that as part of the tradition, but it didn't stop the other things from happening. So we do have to have a more critical view. But look what's happened in our country already with the supposed critical race theory, the supposed CRT. There's so much misinformation about that, and politicians getting away with claiming that kids are told to be ashamed of their whiteness in kindergarten, which has nothing to do with any of these things. So we have to be careful, but also bold to put forth a doctrine of, our tradition is about repentance for evil, and it's one that believes in forgiveness with reconciliation. And that's another part of Fratelli Tutti that I didn't get into here either. The Pope talks about how forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. And sometimes we put those together, but we have to have a historical memory of the harm that was done, and that reconciliation can be a slow and painful process, a necessary one, but it's not an automatic thing. There's some beautiful reflections in Fratelli Tutti about that. And that's also part of the peace building, the active, the pro-peace building, is we can't just paper over the sufferings that people have felt. There's got to be a real accountability. So I don't have a step-by-step answer for how we get to that, but I think we all have to be engaged in that conversation now as well.
Thank you so much. We are coming to the end of our time. Maybe I could just offer you the chance to offer any last thoughts and a closing blessing. And I will give you a little commercial announcement. But I'm happy to stay on with anyone who wants to talk, and you don't have to, but if you're free, you can stay on a few more
I have to
minutes.
drive to Cincinnati next, so I'm going to have to go.
Oh, you
but
have to go to Cincinnati. God bless you. Well, so just to wrap it up then, a lot of Fratelli Tutti talks about politics, but within the vision of what I call universal love, such a good word for a universal nonviolent love is the calling of Jesus and the reign of God. And he goes on and uses the word social love, it's very important, and political love. And all of it I talk about in terms of the politics of nonviolence. And my friend James Douglas, one of the great thinkers of nonviolence 60 years ago in his book, The Nonviolent Cross, was really the first person ever to ask, what are the politics of nonviolence? I think Francis is really beginning to address that, which is why I want him to go further and to do an
very much
encyclical.
so, yes.
Yeah, well, can you want to say the closing words to us on a politics of nonviolence and universal love? And then I will wrap it up and you can give us a closing blessing.
Sure. So I would say, I mean, you summarized it very well, what Pope Francis is getting at here. He's challenging us to move beyond indifference for sure, but also to move beyond the idea that we're colleagues or that we're associates because of common interests. Let humanity be our common interest, and the well-being of the other, like the Good Samaritan, be a common interest. And when it becomes policy, when it becomes the expectation rather than what we have accepted to be our political discourse, that's what's important.
That's wonderful. Well, everybody, how about a round of applause for our guest, special guest, Bishop John Stowe. Thank you so much for being with us and offering us these reflections. And I hope everybody is able to go and read Pope Francis's writings and all of his great writings. Before I ask you to give us a closing blessing, let me just give a little plug for the Beatitude Center. And thank you, everybody, for supporting the Beatitude Center. And wow, there's a bunch of other fabulous Zooms coming up through the end of the year, including, so in 2 weeks, I have my friend Frida Berrigan going to talk about her father, Philip Berrigan, my friend, the great, great legendary peace activist, who this year will be his 100th birthday. Please join us for that. That's going to be a lot of fun. And then I overdid it. In June, I have 3 Zooms, 2 of the leading environmentalists on the planet. First, Bill McKibben, who was the very first person to write about climate change and the founder of 350.org. And he's just brilliant. He's an old friend of mine, and he's happy to do a Zoom with the Beatitude Center. Larry Rasmussen is the first theologian to write about climate change and a theology of the environment, if you can believe that, in the 1970s. He has a new book out from Union Theological Seminary. He's going to join us. The longtime Catholic worker, Frank Cordero, is going to be a kind of follow-up with Bishop John. He's a friend of John's and I. And he's going to talk about, just being in the Catholic Church in the United States, which is so often on the side of the rich and the war makers. And what do we do about that in light of Jesus? And then in July, I think one of the leading activists for peace in the United States is going to do a Zoom, Medea Benjamin, founder of Code Pink, who's done so much good work and has a new book out on Ukraine. And she's going to talk about nonviolence and Ukraine. Isn't that great? Cornel West is coming down the road. So everybody's got to get everybody to join us. And he's very happy to be with us, and many more. So please tell everybody about the Beatitude Center. Try to get 5 friends to join us. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And I'll ask Bishop John Stowe to give us a closing blessing. So let us pray.
Sure. The blessing of Francis. The Lord give you peace. Let us bless the Lord. May he look upon you and fill you with his peace. May he open your hearts to do his will, your minds to understand his word, and your hearts to expand and to bring others into the fold of his love Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Bishop John. Go forth, everybody, as peacemakers to live and proclaim the Beatitudes. See you next time. And I'll
Thank you.
sign off here real quick.